When prices are driven down to the absolute bottom to secure victory, ultimately, everybody loses. For a long time, China's ascent appeared inevitable. It was the world's workshop, built on an efficiency so intense it was almost artistic. These were cities that never rested, with production lines illuminating the darkness. Prices fell with mechanical precision year after year, until Western rivals eventually stopped trying to compete. It was a marvel of sheer scale, strict discipline, and strategic planning, a civilization converting human effort into raw economic power. However, every marvel comes with a hidden price tag. The very attribute that was China's greatest asset, its capacity to manufacture everything cheaper, more rapidly, and on a larger scale, has transformed into the anchor dragging it down. Welcome to this exploration of finance and history, where power dynamics intersect with economics, and nothing is quite as straightforward as it seems. The narrative of China is essentially the narrative of modern capitalism pushed to its absolute limit, a framework that incentivizes expansion regardless of the cost, even when those costs erode the very future it relies upon. What occurs when the planet's biggest economy optimizes itself to the point of exhaustion? When the pursuit of efficiency turns into self-sabotage. To understand this, we need to rewind to the dawn of the Chinese economic miracle. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping addressed the Communist Party and shattered one of socialism's most significant prohibitions. He declared to the nation that acquiring wealth was not a disgrace, rather, it was an act of patriotism. With that statement, he triggered one of the most rapid economic metamorphoses in human history. Almost instantly, farmers transformed into business owners. Rural landscapes were converted into industrial hubs. Foreign investors, initially from Japan, followed by the US, and eventually Europe, recognized a massive opportunity: low-cost labor, limitless manpower, and a state administration desperate to close deals. China established a few special economic zones, experimental cities operating under different regulations. There was no central planning, no bureaucratic friction, and no demand for ideological conformity. There was only one objective: bring in capital and generate exports. The plan worked almost too well. Shenzhen, once a quiet fishing village of 30,000, erupted into a megacity housing millions. Within 20 years, this blueprint was replicated everywhere. Every province desired its own economic boom. Every town aspired to become the next Shenzhen. Local authorities took out loans to build highways, power stations, and industrial parks, all designed to attract more manufacturing. By the early 2000s, China wasn't merely expanding, it was consuming the global demand for raw materials like steel, coal, copper, and oil. Any Western firm hoping to stay afloat moved its production there. If a product could be made, it would eventually be made in China. Yet, beneath this relentless ascent lay a perilous motivation. Success was defined by being cheaper than any competitor. Local governments vied for factories by slashing land costs, taxes, and wages. Companies competed by reducing margins, compromising quality, and sacrificing profits. Everyone was pursuing growth. Nobody was considering sustainability. It was a race to the bottom masquerading as advancement. For a time, the consequences didn't matter. The engine was too robust. Workers migrated from rural areas by the millions annually, ready to work 12-hour shifts for a fraction of what Western workers earned. The assembly lines never paused. The harbors remained active. Western shoppers received their miracle: cheap t-shirts, affordable smartphones, and the illusion of wealth without inflation. And in the process, China became wealthy. However, somewhere between the construction of the 10th mall and the 100th steel plant, the system started to overheat. The miracle turned into a dependency. Local governments required continued growth to service the debts incurred from building previous factories. Consequently, they built even more. By 2015, China's capacity to produce steel exceeded that of the rest of the world combined. Entire industrial regions were churning out products faster than the global market could consume them. Prices began to crash, not due to technological breakthroughs, but out of sheer desperation. Factories didn't decelerate when profits vanished, they sped up, hoping that sheer volume would offset the losses. It didn't work. This is when a specific term started to gain traction, a concept borrowed from anthropology but now applied to economics: involution. Involution isn't merely about individuals toiling harder for diminishing returns. It describes a scenario where businesses produce more output for less reward, a form of competition that ceases to be about innovation and instead becomes purely about survival. Historically, the term involution referred to Chinese students or employees pushing themselves to the limit for diminishing returns. Today, however, this phenomenon has gone industrial and systemic. Entire business sectors are locked in a winner-take-all battle for market dominance, where pricing is the sole remaining weapon. The flagships of China's modern economy, solar panels, electric vehicles, and batteries, have transformed into battle zones. Numerous companies, often backed by the state, have saturated the market with indistinguishable products, with every firm lowering prices to undercut their rivals. Profit margins evaporated, yet nobody dared to halt operations. In a regime where production volume signals legitimacy, reducing output is seen as a loss of face. Consequently, the cycle reinforces itself. Companies slash prices to maintain their slice of the market. Competitors follow suit. Earnings crash. Wages stagnate. Consumers celebrate, temporarily, until they realize that an abundance of cheap goods is purchased at the expense of genuine prosperity. China has stepped into an age of industrial involution, a self-destructive loop where efficiency eats away at profits, and manufacturing consumes its own purpose. It is no longer a competition for innovation, it is a race to the bottom. And in such races, there are never any victors. This explains why Chinese solar panels are currently trading for less than the cost of making them. It explains why electric cars are piling up in storage lots with no buyers. It is why major tech companies are battling over the same contracting domestic market, even while their valuations plummet. And it explains why, despite hitting record export numbers, industrial earnings dropped by more than 20% in 2024. Because when the entire competition is based on who can be the cheapest, the price is the only variable left to drop. This isn't hypercapitalism, it is capitalism cannibalizing itself. The irony is that China has witnessed this scenario before. Back in the 2000s, when excessive production of steel and coal drove prices into the ground, Beijing was forced to intervene and forcibly reduce capacity, shutting down mines, consolidating factories, and laying off hundreds of thousands. It was essentially economic triage. The nation endured short-term suffering to prevent a complete breakdown. 2 decades later, history is repeating itself. But now, the patient isn't just one specific sector. It is the entire economic growth model. Factories don't shut down simply because the financial data suggests they should. They only close when the political climate permits it. And in China, the political system does not incentivize contraction. It rewards movement, even if that movement is effectively running in circles. Privately, party officials are well aware of the statistics: plummeting profits, stagnant pay, and escalating debt. However, in public, the directive remains unchanged: continue producing, continue growing, continue believing. Because if the engine halts, the illusion vanishes with it. By the 2020s, the Chinese engine of efficiency had mutated into something different, an economy trapped in an arms race against its own existence. To the outside world, it still appeared to be a triumph. Global observers saw record-breaking exports, gleaming new factories, and a supply chain of EVs and solar panels massive enough to power continents. But internally, profit margins were crumbling. The miracle was no longer generating wealth, it was merely recycling it, spreading it thinner and faster each year. Economists term this overcapacity. However, in China, overcapacity isn't considered a flaw. It is a policy. Consider the solar sector. In 2023 alone, China manufactured more than double the entire global demand for panels. Prices plummeted by nearly 40% within a single year. Businesses sold goods at a loss simply to clear their inventory. Scores of smaller companies went bankrupt. Yet, the industry giants continued production, because their local governments required the jobs, the output statistics, and the facade of progress. Now, examine electric vehicles. More than 100 Chinese EV brands are fighting for the same shrinking domestic market. Each one is cutting prices to survive, forcing others to do the same. The government intervenes with subsidies to prevent mass unemployment. But these subsidies only fuel the fire, leading to increased supply, lower prices, and slimmer margins. The trajectory is clear. In the first half of 2024, China's industrial profits fell by over 20%. This occurred even while exports remained robust. Factories are moving more goods than ever before, yet making less money on every single item. The national economy is technically still growing, but the quality of that growth is rotting from the inside. However, there is a twist. Not all of this is accidental. Some of it is by design. The Chinese government has long mastered the art of weaponized efficiency, utilizing subsidies to keep strategic industries on life support just long enough to wipe out their competition. The objective here isn't quarterly earnings. It is about achieving total market dominance. In sectors such as solar energy, battery technology, and electric vehicles, Beijing is perfectly willing to absorb financial hits in the short run. The goal is to secure command over the future. Local authorities channel billions into manufacturing plants, offering low-interest loans and tax incentives so that companies can sell their goods at a loss, not merely to stay afloat, but to wipe out their competition. The strategy is merciless: saturate the market, undercut every rival, and simply wait. Western firms, restricted by private shareholders and the need for immediate profit, cannot sustain this pace. They collapse. And once the global supply chain relies entirely on Chinese manufacturing, China can execute the classic monopoly maneuver: hike prices, dictate the rules, and control the entire value chain. This handbook isn't new. It is the exact same strategy China utilized with steel, rare earth minerals, and shipbuilding. In every instance, they priced their goods lower than the rest of the world until the world had no alternative. However, the scale this time is unlike anything seen before. These aren't legacy industrial commodities. They are the building blocks of tomorrow: lithium batteries, photovoltaic cells, and electric drivetrains, the vital arteries of the 21st century economy. On paper, the plan looks brilliant. In reality, it is brittle. There is a limit to how long a superpower can bleed money, even for strategic reasons, before the system begins to decay. When every industry expects the state to cover its losses, efficiency morphs into a dependency. Companies cease competing based on innovation and start competing for subsidies. Productivity is replaced by politics. And the boundary between a national asset and a national liability starts to fade. That is the concealed threat behind China's price wars. They aren't just commercial skirmishes. They are fiscal time bombs. Every yuan spent keeping zombie factories running today is borrowed from tomorrow's stability. Eventually, the bill comes due. This is what makes this iteration of the China trap so devastating. The very strategy that once allowed China to capture global markets is now threatening to devour its own economy from the inside out. Domination funded by losses isn't a victory. It is simply a delayed collapse. It isn't a lack of demand that destroys empires. It is a lack of meaning. And here, meaning has been swapped for sheer momentum, a machine that cannot hit the brakes because every layer of the system relies on perpetual motion. Local governments require operating factories to service their debts. State-owned banks need those factories to keep borrowing to justify their own ledgers. And the central government needs all of them functioning to uphold the illusion of full employment. If a single link in this chain halts, everything begins to unravel. So, everyone continues to pretend that higher output equals greater prosperity, even when that is no longer true. This is the political rationale behind state capitalism. Manufacturing is proof of control. When growth stumbles, the state doesn't pull back, it constructs another plant. When prices drop, it lowers them even more. When the private sector flinches, local governments rush in with more credit. The remedy for every imbalance is simply more of the same imbalance. It isn't madness, it is survival. Because China's economy isn't just a generator of wealth, it is a generator of legitimacy. Its social contract contains one single clause: keep growing, and the population will keep trusting. That arrangement worked when growth resulted in rising wages. It fails when growth only results in cheaper products. The irony is cruel. China's industrial overproduction keeps global inflation down, yet it depresses its own wages and internal demand. The nation that lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty is now struggling to improve the lives of those very people. And the more it exports its deflation, the more fragile the global system becomes. In the West, cheap Chinese imports once seemed like a blessing. They kept inflation in check, stocked shelves, and made the middle-class lifestyle affordable. But now, that same abundance is exporting fragility. Western factories cannot compete. Emerging nations cannot establish their own industries. The global price of cheap is now stagnation. China didn't invent this trap. History did. This pattern is as ancient as empires themselves. Britain's coal industry once flooded world markets, driving prices so low that even British miners couldn't earn a living. The solution back then: colonies. Captive markets forced to absorb the surplus. Japan's economic miracle in the 1980s slammed into the same wall: overcapacity, deflation, and an aging society that stopped spending. Consider Rome. Its collapse wasn't triggered by an invasion, but by excessive production. Massive plantations relying on slave labor churned out grain in such vast quantities that prices crashed, destroying the small farmers who were the backbone of the republic. Rome essentially fed itself into a state of instability. Every great power that perfects efficiency ultimately confronts the same challenge: Can it pause its optimization long enough to ensure its survival? China's leadership is well aware of this. This is the reason they constantly speak of rebalancing, transitioning from growth driven by investment to growth driven by consumption. However, rebalancing requires time, and time is the one luxury a system hooked on expansion does not possess. So, while Beijing attempts to steer the national ship toward innovation and consumer spending, the provinces continue to construct more factories, more infrastructure, and generate more output, because their incentive structures demand it. It is like trying to go on a diet while the chef continues to serve feasts. The irony is that many of the goods China is overproducing, solar panels, batteries, EVs, are the exact items the planet requires for the green energy transition. Yet, when prices bottom out and businesses go under, even sustainable revolutions can grind to a halt. The rest of the globe receives cheaper technology, but it comes at the expense of China's own profitability. Inexpensive abundance transforms into a trap, not because it fails to generate wealth, but because it annihilates the incentive to create more of it. Once that occurs, efficiency shifts from being a virtue to becoming a malady. China's issue isn't a lack of productivity, it is an excess of it. It is a superpower that has conquered the art of production but lost its equilibrium, a machine capable of flooding the world with products, yet unable to generate sufficient demand to make a profit. There is a harsh symmetry in this. The very dynamic that built China's wealth, relentless competition, now guarantees that no one can pause long enough to remain wealthy. This is the result when growth transforms into identity, when manufacturing supersedes purpose, and when progress is measured by how much cheaper you can make a product that nobody needs any more of. That isn't development. It is involution on an industrial level. And, like every empire that came before, China is discovering that there is nothing more costly than being too cheap. Because when a system optimizes every single variable except balance, eventually, the only thing left to destroy is itself. If this provided you with a new perspective, hit subscribe. History holds the answers, and I will show you where to find them.